All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's just great to see like people in 3 dimensions. It's really super exciting. There are loads of people to thank, and they've been thanked a couple of times, and so I'm just not going to do it, except to thank the team in Sharjah and the team here, most especially for making this happen. So let me just say very quickly, I couldn't be more excited about the amazing group of people that are sitting up here with me. And I wanted to just very quickly tell you where the seeds from this came from. So some of you know that I've been working on Nkrumah's Ghana for a very long time, about at least 20 some years, if not my entire career, and especially on higher education. And I've done a lot of research, including in the National Archives here. And I've also seen what military rule does to archives and how those archives can be destroyed. Now we know that Ghana's colonial archive, a big chunk of it is in Britain. So I've been thinking a lot about where do we find this postcolonial archive, the archive of African liberation. And that many of you have seen the photographs of literally stacks of materials being marched out of Flagstaff House after the coup. Now what I've discovered in this long career of mine is that there is a very rich body of documentation globally.
Recording in progress.
Indeed. Speaking of archives, right. So Nkrumah was an internationalist. He was a Pan-Africanist, and he drew people from all over the world. And then after he was overthrown in that coup, people dispersed. And many of them deposited their papers, New York, London, Dublin, Frankfurt, Johannesburg, and the list goes on. So one of our core questions today is about these records of African liberation. Where are they? What do they look like? And of course, most importantly for me is the key question of access. The political implications of where these things are and who's able to access them. As activists across the continent demand the return, the repatriation of African artifacts that have been sitting in Europe since the plunderings of empire, should we think about these artifacts of history as also requiring some kind of restorative justice? Now, I'm a senior scholar, very senior, I'm realizing. I'm from the global north. I have a research account. I have funding. I've traveled around the world looking at these archives. Think of the implications of that, right? A graduate student here at the Institute of African Studies could never do the work that I've done, ever. It's absolutely impossible because of where that dispersed archive is. The people that are assembled here today with me is my dream team of experts. They're the people I invited, and they all said, yeah, I'll be there. To help us think through these questions, from the educational and scholarly to the political and transformative, not that scholarship and political transformation are separate things. They're my dream team not just because of the insights they will provide today on this panel, but because they are individuals located in places and in institutions where it might just be possible to actually take on the questions of unequal access, to actually think about repatriation, to do repatriation, some kind of restorative justice, to think about African liberation anew in 2022. We are not presenting papers. Nobody has a paper. Judith, put that paper away. It's an informal conversation. We're going to be an informal conversation among us for about an hour. And then we have an hour if we want to open it up to the audience for a general conversation. There may be other people in the room who have much to contribute to this conversation. And let me just say very quickly that Samia Nkrumah will have to leave a little bit early, and so if you have particular things you want to discuss with her, it'd be good to front load them in the conversation. If you look in the program, everybody's there. They're introduced, but let me just say that Samia's there on the end. Joy Bibbins is next to her. Ben Talton, Howard University there. I didn't do it affiliate, so I shouldn't do yours. I'm not doing it. Blessing Mawere's come from South Africa. Judith Apoku Boateng has come from just across the road. And Jesse Weaver Shipley is here as well. So I'm just going to open with a guiding question, and anybody can jump on it if they want to, and we'll just keep the mic moving. And that first question is really just to ask you about sort of where you're situated in terms of your work and how it intersects with this set of questions about the archives of African liberation, documentary records, are the importance of those to new visions of a Pan-African future. The floor's open.
Does that mean you're starting?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, my senior sister colleague, Jean Allman. I'm just really...
Sure, I'm comfortable with this senior.
It's a blessing to be where you are. I hope to be there one day. Right? That means you're still with us. We're thankful for that. I meant that in a very different way. Let's start again. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here. So happy to see all of you here today, and so honored to be with my friends and colleagues. As Jean was saying, it's nice to see people in person. We had Ghana Studies. This was initially planned as part of the Ghana Studies Association conference in July. They're going to be tied together. It would have been wonderful to have our colleagues as part of the Ghana Studies Association here with us, but here we are. And I want to thank the Africa Institute at Sharjah, my good friend Salah Hassan, and of course our lovely hosts, the Institute of African Studies. I'm Ben Talton from Howard University. Just very quickly, don't want to insult anyone who already knows, but Howard University is a private, historically black university in Washington, D.C. About 10,000 students, 7,000 undergrads, 3,000 graduate students. We pride ourselves as being one of the first universities to consistently teach African history. We see ourselves as the founders of African studies. We are one of the first institutes in the world to teach African diasporic studies. We were teaching that in the 1940s and 50s, and when I was an undergraduate at Howard University, it was a required class. So we see ourselves as a very unique and foundational for African and African diasporic studies. I'm very honored to be serving as the director of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center. We are one of the largest privately owned repositories of books and documents on the global black experience. We are an Africana, African diasporic, and African studies library. We are also a museum. We're also the university's archive, and we also have a manuscript division that holds the papers of activists, scholars, intellectuals, including Kwame Nkrumah, which I hope to speak a little bit more in the conversation round of this discussion. We're also the Black Press Archive. We're one of the largest holders of newspapers from around the world tied to the global black experience. These papers are in Setswana, in Spanish, in Haitian Creole, in Portuguese, in English and French. We even have some in German. And one of our big initiatives now is, many of these are hard copies in microfilm. The International Press are microfilm. We're digitizing all of them. So just in this conversation of equity of access, we hold these materials, but to see them, to access them, you must come to Howard University, which for most people around the world is very expensive and really insurmountable challenge to doing this research. So we're digitizing them, and we're going to put them online, and those will all be free to anyone who has access to the internet. Now, part of the conversation, though, is then what do you do with the hard copies and the microfilm, because the grid is vulnerable, and so we're still exploring what you digitize them and make them accessible, and what do you do with what do you do about the vulnerability of long-term sustainability? So that's something we're still continuing to explore. A final note before I pass it is that I was here in March doing research. I'm writing a book on nonviolence and how nonviolence formed a network of activists around the world, from Gandhi to Mordecai Johnson, Kwame Nkrumah, Martin Luther King, etc. And I came here to do research on Kwame Nkrumah's aspect of that, positive action in particular. And I found very little. But then when I went home to my home institution, went to the 7th stack where the Kwame Nkrumah papers are held, I'm still going through it. There's so much. And it just brings us right back to Jean's point about equity of access and about my point with the Black Press Archive. What we hope to do is rectify that and begin to explore the ways in which we could bring our rich collection of Kwame Nkrumah's papers. We actually have two separate collections of Kwame Nkrumah papers at Howard University. How we could bring those to the world so that people in Ghana in particular, but folks in Africa and around the world can have access to them.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Today, please permit me to use this platform to share the news about UNESCO's celebration of today as 27th October as World Day for Audiovisual and Documentary Heritage. So, and please, I would like to refer to, I don't have a theme in my head. I think the theme is enlisting documentary heritage to promote inclusive, just, and peaceful society. So anybody who can tweet it or share anything about documentary heritage, on Twitter or whatever, please, you can do so. So thank you so much for inviting me to be on this. And to answer the question, I should say my institution is one of the very privileged institutions, especially when we talk about decolonizing archives or archives that have been decolonized or and all that, because the archive is called Change Community Archive. Actually, that is where I am here as an archivist, and it is one of the academic resources of the Institute of African Studies. And it's, I should say that, long before decolonization and stuff became a buzz, we had already started, practicing it through the collections that we brought to the archives, and then how Dr. Nkrumah tasked the Institute to document, collect all aspects, or do research in all aspects of cultural studies and the arts, and most importantly to disseminate the findings of these research activities. So this is an archive that is actually promoting this kind of task that Nkrumah gave to the Institute. And we are again privileged because the founder of the archive is the late Professor J.H. Ketia, who also has, I think in his 1963 publications, which is actually one of my very favorite documents in the archive. He said African traditional arts, and I quote him, African traditional arts should be recorded, they should be preserved, they should not merely be recorded, preserved, but practiced as living arts. And he also believes that the arts must develop, and I think when it comes to the archive, I give you the exact quote. So through this, the collections in the archive, are inspired by all these kinds of principles, and ideologies, set down by Nkrumah and Ketia and all the other scholars who actually started, the Institute of African Studies, the move about the Institute of African Studies. So as my director said, the Arabic and Ajami manuscripts, for instance, by Ivor Wakes and the first director of the Institute, Hodgkin, and all that, are also the collection and all the moves around the collection was also inspired by all these facts that Nkrumah gave to the Institute. So the archive started as a music archive, but it's actually grown because it was the interest about the collection was mainly around maybe about Ketia, and he having the idea of documenting all the cultures of the 10 regions and putting them in one pot and cooking them and serving to everybody, so that somebody from Kasina and Nakane can come and feed from the same pot, and the same pot that has a soup from someone from the Volta region, right? Somebody coming from Ghana can come and feed from the same soup, that are the ingredients of the gas, and this was, his whole concept. And the archive is actually just right across the road, so those who are new to the Institute, I'll ask permission for you to come and see what we have. Besides this, we feed from the primary data that is collected by the fellows of the Institute, because it's a research institute. But it's not all the collections there that are, from the research fellows. We also have links with other, visiting scholars, who do research in African studies. So they liaise with the Institute to do the research, and then we manage to get collections from them. Again, we also work with all kinds of all the institutions, lots of archival institutions across the country. So it has grown from a music archive into a manuscript archive, into a special collections archive, and it's still growing actually. It's still growing. Recently we received some very interesting collections from Radley, who was one of the colonial masters who worked with Abose and gold mine in the 1920s. You know, so his grandniece, you know, contacted us and then has, you know, brought all those papers, special letters, you know, that really bring out some of the, I shouldn't say atrocities or whatever, but I should say it has communicated a lot of things that were going on around the era. When you read the paper, it's very interesting. So many of these collections are shipped to us. We also have the privilege of engaging with colleagues like Shipley. Shipley started engaging with the archive in the 1990s, right? So all his research works have been deposited in the archive. I can mention a lot of them. So the Gerald collection, for instance, we got the link through Shipley and we are still collecting. Right? So I think I'll have the opportunity to say more. We have started, just to add on to what he said, we've also started digitizing some of the collections, but we prioritize the music content over all the others because that's for the materials on it have been extinct, and you know, because of obsolescence and all that, we decided to start from, you know, those collections. So we digitize and gradually we're coming up, but we have access to almost everything. So I'll hand over to Rob. Thank you.
I think Joy maybe next, and then Blessing. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy Bivens, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is located in one of the United States' historic Black neighborhoods, Harlem, New York City. And we currently have the privilege of, I would say, stewarding a collection of 11 million items. So the thing I wanted to, it's a lot. But I mean, what I like to say is not to get too caught up in the number, because that is comprised of kind of every single piece of paper, all of the things. One of the things that I feel like I could bring to this conversation is really thinking about the archive as being multimodal, and thinking about the fact that the archive, yes, it is papers, manuscripts, rare books, but it can also be comprised of moving image and recorded sound, which is a big part of what we do at the Schomburg Center. It's also the most complex part of the work that we do, because yes, you can digitize, you can, and if you have magnetic film, tape, you should be digitizing. There are added layers of accessibility, or how to make it accessible, because often there are rights issues that have to be overcome. And we can get into that conversation a little bit later, but I want to share a little bit about kind of how we came to be, because I'm the director and I have to do that. And I also see this as an opportunity to engage with colleagues throughout the diaspora about our materials that reflect the histories and cultures of people of African descent. So we are called the Schomburg Center Collection. I want to give you the full name of our namesake, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who is Afro-Puerto Rican, born in Puerto Rico when it was still a colony of Spain in 1874. And every institution has kind of a genesis story, a mythology around it, and I think it's important for this conversation in that when Mr. Schomburg was a child being educated in colonial schools, he asked his instructor, why don't we ever learn about Black people? Why do we never learn about Africa? And his instructor said, it's because Black people have done nothing. Africans have done nothing. And if I gave you the time frame, right, the late 19th century, you understand that that is the context of world history, what the world is conceiving about not just Africa, but about her descendants throughout the world. So Mr. Schomburg, it must have really gotten under his skin, because he spent the rest of his life collecting materials that not only proved that indeed Africa had a history, but that we had contributed to global world history. And this is the foundation of our collection. And as Harlem, that neighborhood, became increasingly, the residents were Black folks, moved up from the middle of the city. The desire for those materials was so great that we barely could keep the books and the materials on the shelf. So always thinking through the idea that not only are these materials critical, but also that the desire for them is critical. Because a lot of times people will say, well, we don't do this because people don't want it. They want it. They want to know the history. And hence, over the last 100 years, this collection has grown from the thousands into the millions. And it also reflects this history of collecting, whereby the materials of Black folks were not seen as central, and therefore the Schomburg Center just kind of, we grabbed up what we could. And we make materials as accessible as we possibly can. As a matter of fact, accessibility is part of the mission of the larger library system that I work for. But with 11 million objects, you do as much as you can. We are a public institution. I will give you all of the information about how to access both our catalogs, our digital collections, our archival collections, because that is all available. Much of it is available online. That said, since we're talking about Nkrumah and really where the collections of post-colonial Ghana live, some of that is found we don't have the Nkrumah archives as they do at Howard, but what we have are the folks who interacted and engaged with this place and this space. And in one instance, at the behest of Kwame Nkrumah, one of our collecting divisions is called the Jean Blackwell Hudson General Research and Reference Division. And in 1963, Miss Blackwell Hudson was invited by Kwame Nkrumah to come to Ghana to help set up the Africana collections at the university's librarian. So she was here for just a year as the assistant librarian, but she is kind of like our godmother, if you will, at the Schomburg Center, because she's the one who ushered us into becoming a research library. So I'll stop there, pass it on to...
Yeah, blessings, please.
Thanks, Joy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Blessing Mawire, and I'm from the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, and specifically the Thabo Mbeki Presidential Library and Center. So I'll give a bit of background for those of us who might not know about the center. And just to also demystify the terminology of presidential library, because I think most of us, when we hear about that, we think of the American typical presidential libraries, but this one is a presidential library and center. The legacy name is attributed to the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. But it's not about him. It's really a library and center for Africa. So it's a center for Africa's leadership, to understand Africa's past leadership, to explore the current leadership, and to think about our future. So the center is really focused on Africa's renaissance. And the center itself does comprise of a very beautiful 8-domed library, an archive, an extensive archive, a museum, which is the Mbeki residence, which was used in the Mbeki residence, an innovation center for youth engagement and for sustainability, as well as a boutique hotel, which is actually a heritage building attributed to one of the late anti-apartheid movement architects in South Africa. So it's really a privilege to be working with Thabo Mbeki and working closely currently with former President Mbeki, because this is something that is central and key to his heart. So this library in the center does focus on all 54 African countries and really thinking about what can we learn, how can we engage, and how can we bring about a better Africa in the future. In our case, we are Pan-African, and our major focus is on access and equity, and to make sure that the archives and the collections that we hold are available to every African, whether you are in the deep parts of Butare, in Rwanda, or you're in Johannesburg, where there's accessibility, data, everything. We want to make sure that there's access and equality, and not only for researchers who are doing the academic work, but also we are really focused on engaging from youth, and I mean really from primary school. So it's really one of our pillar programs, and our focus is to make sure that the center, yes, we've got, if you look at the archive, it's quite big, it's extensive because we have to hold a lot of material from Africa. But our focus is on the programs, because for us, the programs link to the archive. And the programs is where we're really going to get that African renaissance, because we want engagement with all forms of societies and communities, and it's a place of gathering. And we are really privileged that our main architect for the center, because we're in the process of building, is David Ajayi, whom some of you might know. He's a Ghanaian born and British raised architect, very well renowned for many museums and heritage sites globally, and we're really privileged to be working with him and his team that is actually based here in Accra. And for us, working with the programs, we really thought through what is crucial to Africa and what can we learn from these archives. So we are collecting a lot of archives from our former leaders across the continent, but specifically I'll talk about one of our main collections, which is the Nkrumah collection. We've been very privileged because of President Thabo Mbeki's history, which some of you might know, and his role in Africa's development, and his current role. He's still very active and working through many issues in our continent, and through his relationships with the Allman family, and we were privileged to get the late Dr. Nkrumah's collection, and it's one of our collections that we really hold in high regard because of the history of the president as well. And I think that really links us to today's discussion, but also thinking about the other issues that I know we're going to discuss them later, Jim, about the return of them of the archives. And we are very much involved in that, and thinking about the politics behind these archives and what it means for us currently, but also in the future. So we are working with a mix of researchers from the different universities in South Africa, but also globally. And we're really hoping that we can extend the relationship to the Institute of African Studies and the African Studies in Sharjah because of their mission and their vision as well. In terms of access, for us, digitization is quite key. And I know that later, Ben and I will talk about what our planning and our current work is in terms of collaborating to make sure that these Nkrumah archives are accessible, they're linked, and what it means to current researchers and scholars, and how we can really make sure that they have a footprint, but also they help us think through our current political issues in Africa and how we can better our continent. Yeah, I think I'll stop here for now and talk specifically more.
Great. So I'm going to ask Jesse to sort of bring us up, and then Samia, as somebody for whom this is a scholarly question, a family project, and a political project. Then you can wind it up, and then we'll move on. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Jean, for inviting me. It's very humbling and privileging for me to be here. I'm very honored to be part of this conversation. I want to thank the Institute of African Studies and the African Institute in Sharjah for everything. I also want to thank the School of Performing Arts just across the way, who's going to be hosting Song of the Pharaoh later and has been integral to this as well. Let me start with a quick story about what I'm working on and how it links Nkrumah's sort of vision to some later moments in Ghana's history that I've been trying to work on, and with Judith and with some other people. So I came to the School of Performing Arts in the 90s as a student. So Judith and I have known each other since those days, as I've known a number of you. I was an artist, a multimedia artist, theater, painting, film, and a scholar. And when I came to School of Performing Arts and then Institute of African Studies, I was very interested in the relationship between aesthetic performance and history. When I started studying and learning here and performing and working here, I was profoundly moved by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's vision and how he'd instilled that into a set of institutions and an understanding of what the arts were, had been, and could be. So one story, one of my teachers, Mohammed Ben Abdallah, told me very early on that influenced my thinking to today is, as a former minister in the 1980s, he told us, students, a story about how then chairman of the PNDC, Jerry John Rawlings, had asked them one time, perhaps several times, during a moment of revolutionary possibility, change, transition in Ghana's history. We could talk about what that might mean at different moments. But that Rawlings had asked his cabinet in a kind of down moment during a meeting, who is going to tell the story of the revolution? How is a revolutionary moment recorded? How do people talk about a moment of transformation? And through Dr. Abdallah's telling us, he was sort of asking what that legacy becomes, where does a story get located, and then who has the right, the privilege, the sort of historical memory, and the institutional power and force to tell a story, to hold a story, and or to transform a story. And Abdallah is a much better storyteller than me, so his version of that was very compelling to me and to other students. And that's stuck with me, just the question of who tells the story of the revolution. And everything that's loaded into that. The revolution, a revolutionary moment. One of the things that became for me in more recent years, I'm right now trying to write a book centered around the June 4th, 1979 uprising coup d'etat that brought Jerry Rawlings to power in the first moment. So one of the questions that comes for me is, where are the stories about this particular moment? How do they get told in very different ways from very different perspectives? Literally, are they written down? Are they located in song? Are they located in historical memory? Where do we find them? Are they located in photographs? We can talk a lot more about this, but there's an interesting set of continuities between Kwame Nkrumah setting up a set of institutions around a nation state and imagining something very far beyond the nation state, and thinking about archives that are then centered on cultural forms, cultural production, and what that might be. One of the kind of debates that's very interesting, I think that Nkrumah and his brilliant set of academics, from Professor Nkatia to Professor Opoku, who set up some of the performing institutions, one of the debates that's interesting is, how do we think about the arts as locating tradition in the past versus the arts as something that's creative and changing constantly? One of my other professors that I wanted to mention briefly, who also I think influenced my thinking and is important in this conversation, is popular culture, and I know this is something that Frimpong is interested in. In the 1990s and early 2000s, many of you will remember that a musical genre emerged called hip life music in Ghana, which was a combination of high life and hip hop. And at the time, no one saw this as something very serious or very important. But Professor Essie Sutherland Addy, I remember saying, wait a minute, this is something that the youth are doing. It is something that tells us about the past, and it's something that moves us into the future. So we need to take seriously these kinds of genres that maybe certain people aren't taking seriously, but we need to think about what they tell us about the past, present, and imagining the future. So how do we save cassettes? If you want to listen to hip life music from 1998, it's very difficult right now. What media are they in? Where do they get digitized, archived? What happens to cassettes that degrade very quickly, for example? So some of those questions came up for me. The last thing I would say is, in looking at 1979, 80, 81, 82, 83, there's a number of governmental changes. So if we're thinking about official papers, what gets recorded, and then what happens when a change of government happens. In 66, we know a lot of papers were destroyed. The 1979 coup led to the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, which was in power for 3 months. How much was written down? How much was recorded officially? And what happened to those papers? A new government. A little more than 2 years later, another government. How do those papers get recorded or archived or kept, or what happens to them? Where do things get recorded when people are concerned about their legacy? So one of the things I've been trying to think about is the relationship between events and non-events. If something happens, but it sort of gets written out of history or sidelined or doesn't get recorded in a particular way, how do we think about it as significant? What counts as a revolution? What counts as a moment of significant transformation? And who gets to decide that? Right? Scholars and archivists, how do we then try and give sort of life to things from multiple perspectives? The same event might be told in radically different ways. If you talk to 10 different people, you get 12 different answers. So what does that tell us about how we archive things and how we then tell those stories to give life to the multiple perspectives on the same thing? So let me stop there and turn it over to my esteemed colleague.
Thank you, Jean. Before I answer, I just want to say how happy I always am to be here at the Institute of African Studies. How proud I am of this institute, and thank you to all of you who are working and somehow carrying on with a part of the legacy of our father. I also want to welcome the Africa Institute team. You're at home, and what you are doing is very important, and I'm happy to be part of it in a small way. Now, there are many reasons why I returned home to Ghana after a long absence, almost over a decade ago. But one of the reasons was that in reading about our father, reading his work, there were so many things that I wanted to know more and understand better. And I thought that no, one member of the family must return home and must help find some of the missing links or missing documents about our father, about Kwame Nkrumah. And when I started reading his books, one of the first books I read was Dark Days in Ghana, which he published he wrote and published 2 years after the illegal overthrow of his government. And he could not publish these books with his older publishers, Thomas Nelson and others, because they actually refused to. They said, no, he's no longer in power. They are worried about how the new Ghanaian government, military governments would react. So he had to ask his literary executrix, June Milne, to set up a company in London called Penaf, a publishing company, to publish the books he wrote while he was in Guinea after the coup. And when I was reading Dark Days in Ghana, something struck me. I think it's one of the earlier chapters. He said, when he was talking about the damage that happened to Flagstaff House, as Jean mentioned earlier, then he gets to his office, and he said, my office received special treatment. Everything was destroyed, papers, books, notes, everything. But he said the thing that disturbed him the most is that he had precious notes on the history of Africa and the Encyclopedia Africana project that you just mentioned, which Dr. Du Bois and others started and others took over. And he said he had precious notes. Those were his words.
and documents and papers. And he was hoping and praying that by some special miracle, someone would not destroy those. They can destroy anything, but not those. And I was struck by that this, more than anything else, perhaps more than even the loss of political power, that really disturbed him, the books and manuscripts and things that were lost. And this is coming from a man who was, as June Milne had told me when I first met her the first time in London, she said, Samia, your father was a maker and writer of history. I mean, this is coming from a man who wrote profusely. He wrote about 14 books, 21 pamphlets, and so this is someone who wrote everything. And in Dark Days in Ghana, you see him analyzing the coup. I mean, this must have been painful, but he took time to analyze it, the reasons, why, what happened, in great detail. So I'm very happy that we are having this conversation, and that over the years we are thinking of, having more discovering and recovering some of those papers and manuscripts. Another thing that disturbed me a lot is that his books, and okay, he has books, he has speeches, there are recorded documents on policies like the development plan, specifically the 7-year development plan that was truncated, and all these together, that body of work is so important for us today. Today we are, most African countries and most countries which fall under the term developing countries, our people are grappling with problems. Specifically, we know we have not been able to raise the standard of living of our people, which was the main reason for political independence, to be followed by economic emancipation or decolonization. But particularly now, that and the need for Africans all over the world, not just the continent, to work together, plan together, build up our industries together. All this is making me think that, yes, we need to recover all the papers, all the documents, everything, because it might be terribly useful, most useful for us today. You can love Nkrumah, you can hate Nkrumah, but he has become a political point of reference in Ghana and Africa. You cannot decide to ignore completely what he was saying or doing, whether you agree with it or not. And for heaven's sake, let us debate it. Let us bring it to the fore. Let us discuss it, And it's amazing what we might discover and the conclusion that we might come through. When I read how he, not defended even, he was just explaining why he chose the one-party state. Why should Ghana follow one-party state? And as I was reading through, I just came to the conclusion that I perfectly understand. Even though now, maybe today, it might not be relevant for us to discuss that. But what is relevant for us to discuss is that we need to unify our forces and rally around a vision or a pathway for our development. There's no doubt about it. So, decades pass and we use different terms, but the principles and the objectives and the hopes and the aspirations remain the same. So everything that has happened is relevant to us today. And we gain courage, we gain inspiration, we gain hope from delving into the past to somehow give us the courage to carry forward. So thank you to all of you involved in this. Yes.
Thank you, Samia. That really brings us, I think, to a nice point to look. We can bemoan what's happened, but the question really is about looking to the future. So I'd like us to kind of make that shift and talk a little bit, maybe for about 20 minutes, and then leave the rest to bring the audience in. But the question, too, that you raise so eloquently, these are not just scholarly questions. This is not scholarship for scholarly sake, an archive for an archivist's sake. These are political questions, they're contemporary questions. The Institute of African Studies was set up as a scholarly institution, but also played a key role in Nkrumah's vision for rethinking how knowledge is produced about this continent. So I know there's lots going on in the world, but I thought maybe Blessing and Ben could talk a little bit about ways forward, and we think about that and what both ways forward, but the real challenges to this vision of equal access and some kind of reparative justice when it comes to access to the archives of African liberation.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for that. That was very inspiring, especially for us who are doing the work every day. So looking forward, which is where we are currently, we cannot ignore our past. Like she just said that we cannot ignore it, but we have to think about what can we learn and what is happening now and what is going to happen in the future. So as a Thabo Mbeki Foundation, I think most of us know that President Mbeki, since he was in office up to now, his vision is always African Renaissance. So how can we have that rebirth and move forward? And I'll start with the challenges and then talk about some of the solutions that we are also exploring, especially in terms of gathering and making sure that we understand our past. One of the main challenges that we've identified is that most of the history of Africa, pre-colonial and colonial times, was written for us. So it wasn't written by Africans. So there's major gaps in our history. And that's something that we are really trying to correct as a Thabo Mbeki Foundation, and especially through the Library Center. And we've got a number of projects where we're engaging with those living legends that are there, but also engaging with the archives to really understand and to fill those gaps. So it's a major challenge for us, but also because some of those archives are not accessible to us because they are not available here in Africa. So instead of having a negative relationship with our colleagues in the global north generally, we are really engaging in a positive way with most of those institutions to solve this gap. So we have engagements with different institutions, from research and academic institutions, governments and others, to make sure that we have a mutual understanding, we repatriate where we can, but also so that they understand the importance of those archives to Africans as well. I'm really happy that specifically in the Kwame Nkrumah collections, one of our collaborators and partners has become Howard University, especially because we're holding a collection that was kind of split in two and deposited Howard, but also deposited here in Africa. And because when we talk about access, for us it also speaks to equity. So we talk about equity of access. And for us, working with Howard, our vision is to really link these two collections and to make sure that they're accessible. So digitization is a tool. It's a tool really. We are working together to get funding to make sure that these collections are digitized, they're made available, they're linked, and they are available beyond the scholarly or academic platforms, if I can put it like that. And that they feed into those gaps that I spoke about earlier, where our history was written for us, and to make sure that we understand the thinking behind what was written for us, because these are the original archives that we have. So yeah, I'll stop here, Ben, and you can.
Yeah, thank you for that. Not much more to add, because you said it very nicely, but I appreciate what you were saying about the history. And I have the privilege of going upstairs in my center and putting my hands on these papers. Because when you digitize them, you won't be able to put your hands on the actual papers. And it's a privilege. And so then what do we do? Who is in control of the actual, who owns these actual, who do they belong to? I don't have the answer for that. Of course, legally they belong to Howard and the Thabo Mbeki Institute, but historically in terms of legacy, who do they belong to? Where should we put them once they're digitized? That's a conversation we will have to have. But also in the spirit of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, there's collaboration between institutions. I'm very proud in the short time that I've been at the director of the Mona Spingarn Research Center. I spent a lot of time doing meet and greets, finding ways to collaborate. We are collaborating with the Gordon Parks Foundation, so we'll be the largest owner of Gordon Parks photographs outside of the Gordon Parks Foundation. And now we have a partnership with them, and they're sponsoring a fellowship. So that's collaboration in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, in the spirit of Black Power. We were founded in the Black Power movement in 1972, although we're 110 years old as a library. The center came out of the Black Power movement. And so this is just another extension of that. Right? This is an African-American legacy institution, although we're very diverse in our blackness, because we have a large Ghanaian population and Ghanaian-American population and Jamaican-American population. But here are two institutions collaborating. So I think in the spirit of Kwame Nkrumah, we're living that legacy of Pan-Africanism, of collaboration. So I'm very honored to be in this endeavor.
Joy, I wondered if you wanted to speak at all to this idea of ownership. This panel actually started over breakfast this morning, so sorry that not everybody was there, but yeah, we had about 2 hours of sort of preliminary. But you had really interesting insights about being in a public institution and how your collection is viewed versus, Ben's collection, which is at a private institution.
So we collect for the benefit of the community of New York and then the larger research and scholarly community, but also think of scholars as folks like yourselves who have PhDs, or the people around the corner who just want to know more and are interested in pursuing their own questions. In terms of ownership, to what Ben said, yes, the New York Public Library, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture may hold legal ownership of materials, but the materials, I prefer to think of it as stewardship. Stewardship in the sense that we are endowed by the public through public funds with the tools to house materials, the tools to remediate when there's mold or when there are all other kinds of issues that come with things, with papers. And as I mentioned earlier, we think of archives very broadly. So collecting over manuscripts, archives, rare books, photographs and prints, art and artifacts, which are those three-dimensional objects which require a different level of care and a different approach in terms of ownership, moving image, recorded sound, and then our general research collections, which are available to everyone, but because of the nature of the collection, much of it is constituted mainly of rare books, small presses. We still collect newspapers from all over the continent, from around the diaspora, so making all of these things available is what we're there for. We are there to help you find what you need to answer the questions that you have. And in terms of, I don't see us as owning something. I see us as being stewards of it. And it is, there's a difference between the private project or the private institution and the public institution. And mainly it's because we are funded by the people of our city and by the people of the state. And also through other private foundations, that the expectation is we are making this as accessible as we possibly can. And personally, just from practice, I think that the notion that we would collect, acquire, and then sit on it or not make it available feels, one, ethically wrong, but two, because of the resource intensity of maintaining these collections, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we do the best that we can to make as much as we can accessible, again, barring rights issues, because we may not own it, but the creator of the material may still hold ownership of that, and so there are obstacles to what we can share based on that.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Judith, not to put you on the spot, but I am. So I'm thinking about this kind of breaking down the boundaries, getting rid of this idea that these archives are somehow owned and making them broadly accessible. So when you're sitting here, an archivist at the Kwame Nkrumah Institute of African Studies, what is if you could imagine what this world looked like if these borders broke down. I mean, what would it do to the Institute's collection? What would it do for students here? What's your dream scenario over the next 10 years?
Thank you very much, Jane. I don't even know where to begin from. Sitting down and listening to my fellow panelists, some ideas have actually come to mind. And from our archives initiatives, we've come across a number of issues. First of all, I see that we will notice, that there are lots of a black star, right? Very rich collections all over Africa, and fine, I speak for Ghana, right? Locked up. The value of all these collections are locked up. And there are lots of collections, locked up with individuals and institutions. We are lucky to have the Thabo Mbeki one, which is, clear for everybody to see. The one at Schomburg is clear for everyone to see. Howard's one is clear. But then there are other ones that are locked with individuals, who probably might have worked or engaged with the with the colonial people who worked in the colonial whatever, and even post-colonial, people. So how do we get this material? How do we unlock them? Even in the first place, how do we fish for these kinds of materials? Okay, how do we entice the people or the custodians of these collections to break them to institutions, archival institutions, to support research, research activities, teaching and learning and all that. These are questions that I leave to scholars. And I feel, I think from experience, I see that historians, I always say that one of my, excuse me to say that archives lovers are historians. Historians are the people who have to really go to dig the gold. And you need to properly go dig the gold and bring them out. Because we are archivists, we sit in our spaces, and sometimes we are not really mandated to go fish for the gold. But sometimes if the historians don't do it, then the archivists who are very proactive have to go fish for that gold. So this, I see that yesterday I was discussing with Jesse that there's this thing called digital humanities and all kinds of, how do we even support scholars, as archives? Because the materials are there, lots of them are locked up. How do we get them? Secondly, in people, especially archival institutions in the global north, this thing called digital colonialism. These archives are so vulnerable, especially those who have the collections. Collections are locked up. People who are very smart, okay? They come in the form of scholars, they come in the form of researchers and whatever. Oh, I have this huge money, I'll give to you. I want to digitize the collection and then I'll keep copies in my archive. This is going around. Lots of spaces within African archives. How do we circumvent this? These are questions I leave to scholars and all people who are engaged with archives. Again, historians need materials to publish, to do whatever. How do we even expose people who are managing the collections that do not even have access to funds and all that. How do you expose some of these or link some of these institutions to fund this, to be able to look for funding to digitize these kinds of collections? Again, let me just quickly touch on repatriation. Everyone is talking about repatriation. That is fine. A lot of, like this year, I went to BFI. I managed to get a very, very nice list of our collections, the Ghanaian collections in BFI. Somebody said, oh, we should go for all our collections in BFI. This is ours, is this. What have we done with the film collection in Ghana? We haven't done anything good with them. We lost a chunk of them, you know, to all these structural adjustments, whatever. But if you are going, we need to be very strategic. If you are thinking about repatriation, either go for digital collections or look for funding and give to BFI, right? Because BFI is not prioritizing the content over their own cultures. You need to look for funding, give to BFI, and then you can tap from the information. How do we do all this? How do we discuss all these conversations? I think these are some of the things that is going through my head, you know, as an African Studies archives. Yes. And then second, lastly, how do we network these archives? How do we network this archive to the Institute of African Studies archives? How do we? It's so key. But before doing that, we need to digitize. We need to unlock the value of these collections, and then we can play with the objects. Thank you very much.
So you were tapping?
I was tapping because what you just said makes everything, the struggle that it took to actually get here worth it, because I think the networking is critical, right? If in fact there are resources on the other side of the water that will move your process forward, likewise move our process forward to make sure that we are really what we say we are, which is a diaspora collection of the diaspora, then I would really love for more forums for us to engage in those conversations and that planning, because I do think that's how we save our patrimony. That's how we make sure that the film, which we can barely handle at the New York Public Library, thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of magnetic tape that we have been saying for the last 15 years, since I was in another institution, that we know is going to disintegrate. It does not last, and none of this stuff. I think that even in our planning and our discussions, we need to talk about obsolescence, which is something that we never want to talk about. The fact that nothing, I don't care what it is, lasts forever. And what are the ways in which we are using technology to our benefit, using these forums to our benefit, to ensure that 200 years from now, folks can be having conversations that are really informed by work that we've done right now to protect our heritage.
So with everyone's agreement, I think we could open it up and continue the conversation in conversation, and maybe take a few questions at a time or comments. And if somebody could also handle microphones.
So we have Samuel, and I think this guy is in the back next.
Okay, switch.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think this is very enlightening. I like the fact that we hinted at the possibility of the relocation of archival material. But we know for sure that as researchers, the life of any paper archive is in the hands of the researchers. Why I say so is just simple, that researchers academics have the capacity or capability of destroying documents. So if we say we are clamoring for the return of these documents, to what extent are we sure that these very documents will not be destroyed by our own researchers, and normally I refer to them as researchers or academics of fortune. If you go to the archives, you see clear pages being cut out with razor blades. These are facts. We have issues where papers have been taken away from files just because they do not seem to further the cause of a particular researcher or family. So I just simply want us to look at that. The second contribution I would like to make is true that in our narrative and attempt at representing history, especially as historians, we more or less, in most cases, are constrained by the very documents that we come across. So certainly trying to project a history that is just a representation of the very document that we actually access. I think that we should also think of the recording and archiving of our oral narratives, because I think it is in that way that we are able to provide a kind of balanced historical narrative, especially now that we risk losing those who have had the experience from maybe the 40s, 50s, and 60s. If we are not able to get that, then we are also going to subject our narrative to a kind of one-way traffic, more or less. So this is just what I want us to consider, that in as far as we are thinking of the paper archive, oral archives too, we should think of preserving that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Toward the back on this side over here. No, behind you, Satan. Yes. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Anna Rose. I'm a journalist specialising mainly in visual arts, but obviously that now covers these topics as well, which is great. I wanted to point out, because I feel like since the beginning of this conversation, the topic of obsolescence has come up a lot, and digital obsolescence and kind of recent historical records and how they degrade. And I wanted to flag, I'm sure that you all know that especially in the States and in Europe, because of the rise of digital art, there's so much money and research going into fighting obsolescence and preserving film, tape, and even kind of recent digital archives like computer files from the 90s, stuff like that. And I think a lot of this is open source because of how important it is. I feel like a lot of that information is out there, and I don't know, I'm happy to kind of, I don't want to ream off random things, but I'm sure, but if you want to know any of the names of things that I've had to come up with in just with my work, I'm happy to share these organisations that are putting a lot of money and research into that topic.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take two more. I'm going to take Manu and Satan, and then we'll open it up whoever wants to answer whatever.
Yeah, my name is Manu Herbstein. I came to Ghana first in 1961, and I've lived most of my adult life here since. In the 60s, I spent a little time in Scotland and in India and in Zambia. Now, during this long lifetime, I wrote and received many letters. I'm currently busy transcribing all those letters. They're of variable value. Some of them are of great interest. They're connections with the ANC and with the anti-apartheid movement, as well as events here in Ghana. Now, why I mention this is it strikes me that there must be many people in Ghana, not academics, who have stashed away somewhere a whole lot of family letters. And these are a source of immediate personal reaction to historical events. So perhaps an appeal could be made for people who have these to bring them out.
Thank you, Manu. It's good to see you too. Satan, and then we'll get some responses.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question, and I was always very curious about your roles working in institutions that hold these archives. Do you consider yourselves to be sort of agents to export information or archives out of these countries that you're in, back into Africa, and what happens when that is all done? Thank you.
Okay, anybody want to answer anything? I'll just pass this down.
Switch.
Maybe I should say something now before I leave.
Yes.
Since I'm leaving, sorry.
No, please, that's why I asked.
Okay, but okay, many things came to mind, but oh dear. Okay, so we come back. There was one thing I wanted to say, but I remember maybe it's not that important now. But anyway, I forgot to mention that I actually visited the Thabo Mbeki library, and of course I did so in appreciation of Mbeki's legacy and the role he played. But I also had a secret mission. I actually went, and I remember I met with the director at the time, I think. Okay, his name escapes me now. But I said, I know that June Milne gave those papers to you, but would you please tell me if something sensitive, if you find something delicate or sensitive that comes out? Because most of those papers, I assume, I don't know the contents, but were correspondences between June and our father, also, but mostly correspondence that happened after the illegal overthrow of his government. And I thought, okay, I don't want anything delicate to come out, at least without us knowing it. I'm saying I'm here, I want to protect the legacy, protect our father to a large extent. What if something very personal or politically sensitive comes out? And I remember them laughing and saying, oh no, we whatever it is, that's not how we things happen with archives, and trying to reassure me. But yes, indeed, I very often think, what happens to some of those sensitive documents? And what if someone would want to use them for whatever purpose? So it's something we need to think about. I also, a few years ago, I had this idea that we must have a Kwame Nkrumah library. There's so much material all over the place, and that is a good thing. There could be material on Kwame Nkrumah or things written about him or in different places. That's all well and good. But I just thought, okay, but right here in his base, what he called his base, Ghana, perhaps there should be something. There should be something about him. And I remember June telling me that, Samia, if you had somewhere in Ghana where I could give you those papers and you would take care of them and make sure they don't disintegrate. Yes, I know. But this brings the question of, yes, who should have what and all that. It's something for all of us to think about. But another thing comes to mind, and which I wanted to share with you. Over the last 2-3 years, I met 2 lecturers, 2 scholars, one from Britain, and I think he's Scottish, but I'm not sure, and another from Denmark. So these are white people.
but they both wrote, they took one of the topics that Kwame Nkrumah delved into, like in the case of Mark Langdon, he wrote about neo-colonialism, excellent book. He sort of made it relevant to today and showed different aspects, different ideas that Kwame Nkrumah brought up at the time in the 60s, and showing that it's the same till today, bringing it up to date basically. And in the case of the Danish scholar now, he told me that, I met him and he told me he was doing his thesis, he was writing, and then suddenly he had what you are all familiar with, of course, a complete block. He was totally paralyzed in his writing and he couldn't go any further. So he started reading some of the African writers, and he stumbled across Kwame Nkrumah's neo-colonialism, I think, no, not Revolutionary Path, because that's barely accessible, one or two other of the books. He said by the time he finished, he had clarified what was blocking him mentally, and he managed to finish and present his dissertation. So when he started teaching at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, he would always reference some of Nkrumah's books. And that made an impression on me, because I thought, well, if two white scholars, and I'm sorry to use the word white like that, but I mean it, meaning that if someone from a different background, different race, different culture, has, you know, the wherewithal, the time, the interest, the passion to explain Nkrumah, if you will, to students, why are we not doing it? You know? Why are Africans and black people not doing it as much? I know there's this Wipo who wrote a very good book, another one, an African living in the States, wrote a very good book on Kwame Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism. But it just brought home to me the challenges that African researchers have. That you need the money, you need the exposure, you need so many things to be able to lay your hands on certain material. And perhaps the reason we are not producing so much, you know, is not just because, in the case of Nkrumah, not only because he was demonized, which he was. I mean, there was a law against having even a picture of him after the illegal overthrow. So many of the letters, the books, the pictures were destroyed out of fear. Many people had to hide or destroy any kind of communication or any kind of information they had on Kwame Nkrumah after the coup. But in addition to that, to the loss of those papers and documents, there's also the need for us to find a way of making it easier for our scholars to research and have access to some documents. That's it. I just wanted to share those with you and wish you well, and again reiterate how proud I am of all of you taking part in this discussion. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Joy, were you tapping again?
I guess I was tapping in response to a couple of things that had to do with the destruction of archives, but also just building an archive is a political project, right? So that it has a political connotation to it. I see our job as making as much as possible, as widely accessible for other people to make their own interpretation of it, whether I like it, whether you like it or not. And in many instances, especially when you're dealing with living donors or families of artists or writers or what have you, we often have to make concessions about what we can make available in a certain amount of time. So this part remains closed until 2075 or something. Once everybody that has anything to do with it has gone on and passed on. But I just want to make a plug for the free exchange of information, because we are in a time where even books, the interpretive works are being banned and there's being much put on lists about what you can't read, what you can't. We have to protect the right of the researcher, the right of the artist, the right of the interpreter to utilize the material in any way they see fit, and continue to collect with that thought in mind, and not trying to hide information or redact or cut things out or what have you, because that limits the creation of knowledge immensely. So that was all I wanted to say in terms of just listening to how because we can't have it both ways. We can't want the material and then want to protect some aspects of it. Just, that was my thought.
Does anybody else want to respond to the set of questions out there? Okay, and then we'll go for one more round.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll respond to Prof. Samuel's question. In terms of repatriation, I think you're correct about some of the institutions that do not have the means or resources or skills to take care of those collections. And I think it goes back to Judith's earlier point when she was noting this, and also to what Joy spoke about. But as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, one of our engagements, especially with institutions in the global north, is to understand what we can do and what we can't. Where we've got the skills, resources, and the ability, would love to repatriate the originals. But I think now we talk more of digital repatriation, because one, it makes sure that we share resources, because there are a lot of African scholars also in the global north, as we know, and as this panel is representing, that also need access to those collections. And also to make sure that we are not talking only of paper-based material, but also talking about other types of formats. So for example, your artifacts, your objects, a whole lot. I'll give the example of Benin. I think most of us know the repatriation of the Benin sculptures. So for us, it's quite key to understand what we are actually talking about in terms of repatriation. Is it everything, or is it just the paper-based material? But also we're understanding that even the 3D objects, the artifacts and so forth, can be digitized because the technology is there. However, there is also need to understand the history behind some of those objects and artifacts, because some of them have got a cultural importance and significance to us as Africans. And those, for us, they need to be repatriated, and they need to be in the country and on the soil of Africa. So for us, those are keys. Those are the conversations that we're having with some of our colleagues in the global north. And then when we talk about oral histories, we have millions of recordings of videos, and it's very, very important for us, and I'm happy that you talked about that. And one of the projects that we are doing at the foundation is called SADET, where we are looking not only at the colonial history, but also pre-colonial, to really understand what our history was, and taking a lot of time to talk to what we're calling living legends. I think somebody talked about some of the people we can talk about who've experienced from the 60s and earlier and so forth, and making sure that their oral histories are translated into material that can be accessed by everyone. So we're working on books. We've got 14 volumes so far that we've published, and looking at different aspects of our African histories. From the most recent volume, which is really fantastic for me, is looking at the history of women and leadership, pre-colonial up to now. So really understanding those intricacies, and also making sure that the oral histories are preserved. And now I think when you talk about, somebody talked about open access resources and so forth, nowadays we talk about digital preservation, because we want to always think about what is the future like. And then lastly, someone also commented on our roles, some of us, I don't think there will ever be a point where we collect everything and then it's finished, because it's all about collaboration, it's all about sharing, and most importantly, what Jean alluded to earlier, it's about thinking about the future. So the point is not in collecting, but why we are collecting. So really thinking about the research, the programs, the engagement, and what we are trying to drive forward, which is a better Africa for tomorrow. So really, there is not going to be a point where we're going to collect and say, now we are finished. Thank you.
Okay, briefly. Okay. So I just want to answer the question raised by Satan, I think with regards to the agents, right? So I think custodians of archival collections, together with scholars, right, should be the agents, right, that you're talking about in terms of, spearheading this move for repatriation, right? Because we need to fill in the gaps. My colleagues talked a lot about filling in the gaps, and I think the custodians need the materials to fill in the gaps. The historians also need the scholars and the materials to write or to do more research. So these people are the people that have to be the agents, come together and form some kind of a move, to see how we can fish out for all these materials that are locked up. Again, I think Manu, I didn't get your name well. You made mention of how we should appeal, to people who have materials that are locked up. Yeah, I thank you so much for that. I think that's one of the initiatives that the Nkrumah Archives here has been in. We have been, trying to entice people. In fact, especially our friends are the very old people. They come in and we entice them with tea there, and we ask them all kinds of questions. You have this. So through this, we managed to inherit a number of collections. So our archive runs a project that calls the Archive in Archives project. So the archive is Nkrumah Archives, but it has a number of archives, under that umbrella. So we have Professor John Collins's High Life Archive. We have, fully inherited that collection. The Ganaba archives are also, being inherited by the archives through NYU, and then we keep inheriting, So we go, and few people also get to ask. And there was a call that we made recently through a project called Heritage Photo Lab, where we needed to fish out for photos from the 50s, 60s, 70s, in fact, vintage photos. We were amazed, about the collections that came. Very rare collections, on lifestyle in Ghana, from the 50s, 60s, 70s. We mounted an exhibition, at, I think, the Museum of Science and Technology, yes. So thank you for that, the opportunity to see what we can do. And besides that, collections like Gerald's, so we wouldn't have been able to see this. This is rich collection, which I actually leave Jesse to see, because very rich, over 200,000 negatives, and we never would have come across it. And it was sitting there waiting for the archivists and the historians and the scholars to go for them. I need Jesse to see.
To say something briefly about that, for this project researching 1970s coups and counter-coups, I've been interviewing a lot of elders who were around in those days talking about their histories, and a lot of times they have materials that are very rich. Written materials, but also multimedia, multimodal things. And just in this particular instance, I'd interviewed Gerald Forson, who had been a classmate of Jerry John Rawlings at Achimota, and had taken many pictures from Achampong times, and then when Rawlings was in power, of various kinds of things, as well as many other things, life in those days, but 70s and 80s days, up through the 90s. And he had them sitting, some of them had been deposited, but many of them were literally in his closet. And he didn't know what to do with them, and he wasn't sure, of the provenance and all these kinds of things. And we got through talking, and we realized, well, it's a little more dramatic. I'll save the dramatic story for you. But they were just sitting there, and I called Judith literally from his porch and said, look, there's a there's files and files, which turns out to be probably 200,000 negatives sitting here. Can we start to digitize them and use the Institute as a place to perhaps house them, at least to help Gerald to feel like there's some space that these are going to, and make them accessible? No real agenda. They tell multiple stories, many of them that we don't even know. And Gerald, first of all, is very happy to have someone listen, someone pay attention, someone take seriously what he'd done as a photographer. So we started to do that, and it's in process. One of the interesting things that this becomes then, I think that's crucial to the future, is a set of dialogues. There's people in these photographs, we don't know who they are. Gerald knows some of them. Some of them are official events. The officials are no longer recognizable to most people. So then, okay, who can we call? Who's going to know who's in this photograph? So then the question becomes, how do you create a dialogue around this? How does that then become accessible to PhD students, or someone wants to work on the 1972 coup, or someone wants to work on Unigov, the union government movement. Oh, here's some photographs. Let's get this PhD student, or let's get this undergraduate to look at it. Who can they call to find out who's in these pictures, and where does that go? So it becomes a bit of a dialogue, and as panelists have been pointing out, once you open up access, first of all, that's a project and a political project, but then it becomes something that is in itself leads to new possibilities, and we don't know what those are going to be. The last thing I'll say is I would like to emphasize, one of the things I found when I was in the Schomburg archives 4 or 5 years ago is that the project of demonizing Nkrumah wasn't just simple. That when Nkrumah was overthrown, there was a clear plan in place to narrate what that coup was about. And you can see it in some of the papers of the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, who now is Ambassador Williams. His papers are deposited at the Schomburg. And if you look at his papers, you can realize, wait a minute, there was a plan in place to narrate how the story of Nkrumah and Nkrumah's overthrow was going to be told. Without having a political agenda ourselves, which we all do, of course, to some extent, but just to reveal, wait a minute, there was a story that people were trying to tell about this political event. And unless you have all sides of it, unless you realize there was a plan in place, not just to overthrow Nkrumah, but then to create a story about Nkrumah as this authoritarian figure who was, not politically thinking about Africa as an institution, but rather just had his own power at stake. If you start to take that as a narrative, then you forget the whole process underlying that. If you look at the archives, you can say, wait a minute, there's a real story that was trying to erase Nkrumah's legacy. And the archive shows that if you can get to it. So to make that sort of legible is really important.
Just very briefly, and that doesn't mean I'm going to go on. We were joking that when people say I'm going to be brief, that means they're about to make a very long speech, but I'm going to be brief. But that context is fascinating because one thing I'm trying to do is digitize our administrative files. Because if I give my archive and my wife gives her archive, we're going to have two very different stories about our marriage, right? And so I'm looking at the administrative files, and they're fascinating because we have Amir Baraka's papers. Amir Baraka was one of the foremost writers of the second half of the 20th century, Black Arts Movement. He was a political figure, critic, playwright. And the back and forth between him and Howard on his papers is fast, and they're actually arguing. And he promises to give all of his personal professional papers, but then he sold some of his papers later on to the Schomburg. And so then they're accusing him of violating the contract. So it's really, really fascinating. And Colombia, you see? But also the Robeson family. I'm looking at the administrative files. We're trying to figure out who has the rights to the Robeson papers. We have some, Robeson papers are all over the place, but we have some Robeson museum artifacts and papers and photographs and film. We don't have a contract with the Robeson family. The son and the daughter are trying to get those papers back. We have, though, a letter from Robeson saying that he is going to bequeath his papers to Howard University upon his death. That's all we have. So that's not in his archive, though. That's in the administrative file. So when you do research on Robeson, you don't get that. So that's why our papers are the centrist papers are very important to archive as well. I'm using on Manu's point as well. There's an issue where people don't see themselves as part of history, and therefore their personal papers and letters aren't important. That's just nostalgia for them, and maybe even their children may be burdened by all. It takes up space, and so they keep the furniture, but they dispose of the letters. So we have to think about how we think about. We have to consider how we think about nostalgia and the importance of nostalgia. But it's important for us also to write that context and create our own archives. Right? So I have my grandmother's papers and my great-grandmother's papers, and we hold on to them, and we could organize them in our own way.
So we've got a little over,
15 minutes. So raise your hand if you're in the audience and want to say something. So Rachel and Binyam, can people keep it really short, please? So we'll take the 4. There's 2 in the back, and then there's 2 in the front, but you can start with Rachel, and then Binyam here, and then we'll take the 2 in the back, please.
Thank you very
Brief,
much.
please.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have 3 questions, but I'll keep them very brief. So question 1, rather than fishing, I think was the word, or how do we get our hands on these archives? My question is, in Ghana, what is the work that's being done in terms of conservation and preservation within families, within communities that have these collections? Because to me that's more, we know that communities continue to engage and want to engage with their materials. So is the work being done? If not, could we imagine that that's something that could be done, and what would that look like? But I say that, as an archaeologist who loves old stuff, but also as a critical heritage scholar that's really interested in the ways in which people engage with materials from the past, and we say it's okay even when it means decay and destruction. Because I'm concerned that sometimes some of these conversations revolve around the privileging of scholars and so-called experts. So question 1. So question 2, sorry, I'm feeling shaky because I'm trying to speak fast. Thank you. I'm really interested also in the question of ownership and stewardship. And so I've heard everything you've said about Pan-Africanism and what that means in terms of collecting and management. But what I want to know then is, what does it mean in terms of returning things? I've heard everything you've said about digitizing, but so what would it look like as Pan-Africanists, and how is it different from someone like the British Library, for example? And then the third question is, I'm very happy that today we've been talking about the Arabic and Ajami manuscript collection, because for a very long time it was ignored. And if it wasn't, for the work of Mohammed Hafiz here at Legon, who's published about them, again, how do we collect in Ghana or work with materials, but not fall prey to particular politics? And one being Islamic manuscripts for a very long time here at Legon were not taken seriously, that they're important to conserve and preserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, really inspiring panel and a lot of thoughts. Just one question that I have is, there was a lot of focus on the discussion about access, and partly there was also something about equity, which is more about use. Can we really distinguish access from capacity to use, capacity to interpret, and capacity to critically use? And just to mention probably one concern I have with archives is the fact that, some of it has already been mentioned, it has a gaze, it has a particular gaze, and it requires a collaboration, critical engagement, both by the archivist and by the experts and by anyone who's going to use it. It is very much colonial, it's gendered, it's elitist, so many things we can mention. So access, yes, it's very important. What about capacity to use and abuse it sometimes?
Thank you. And then there are 2 in the back, 1, and then 2. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. So my contribution has to do with, I think, a paper that Prof. Samuel Ntewusu wrote about the banana archives. And I think at the heart of this discussion is the disconnects in the public domain as to what really constitutes history. Because there are instances where you dialogue with people they buy certain food in public and they come across archival documents and they don't know what to do about such documentation. That's one. Secondly, I think we should have a running project where, for instance, Anti-Judith would have, there should be consistent publicity to families. Because just last night I was working on a paper, and it was about the history of one of Ghana's pioneer anesthetics, a woman, Focus Dorothy, called Papafio. And interestingly, her own daughter, who had kept documentation about Focus all these years, did not know that her mom was a columnist for the Gold Coast Times in the early 1930s. So we should have a very interesting way of letting the public domain knows what constitutes history. And because most of in a Ghanaian setting, most family disputes after the demise of a person probably could be a very historical figure. People are really focused on the properties, but not the paperwork. And usually they leave it to people who have no clue as to the utility, the value of those papers. And I think as a nation we've been grappling with this for a very long time, because if you read the accounts of how John Mensah Saba, for instance, came about writing some of his books, he chanced upon some true boys who were going to burn these papers. And I think that has consistently been our problem as a nation. So if we can look at these dimensions too, it will really help. Thank you.
Thank you. And last question.
Yes, I have just two questions, kind of hopping off what everybody has asked. My first thing, going to what Ben said, is what is a practical way to help people see themselves as a part of history? And I wonder how you all think about audience, like who should have access to these archives beyond researchers, historians, and academics? Like if the potential of archives is to help us understand history and help us do better in the future, my thinking is that the people that need to know these things go beyond the academic community. That's sort of my first question, my first thought. And my second thought is, probably this goes maybe more to Judith and Blessing, are there ways in which archiving and speaking about history becomes a policy and political question and has urgency? Because if we're talking about, how can dark days, for instance, inform the current president's governance? Are people in power? What is their relationship to archiving? It's something like that. It's spoken about in Parliament. Something that has any kind of agency. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to combine the agenda here. So, which is we've got 4 questions on the floor, but we also have a coffee at 2:30, and I want to actually stick to our timetable because we can have great conversations over coffee. So what I'd like to do is start from this end and go this way, and you can address them, but I want if you could limit it to about 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll call it a day.
Thank you for such brilliant questions. Obviously, we don't have time to address all of them. I tend to talk quickly, so let me talk quickly right now. Let me end with a quick story, because I'm very interested in what gets destroyed on purpose versus what is neglected. And all of us who are interested in this stuff, we all, grab our heads when we see or hear about things that are destroyed on purpose or by accident. There are a lot of apocryphal stories about TV3 archives being burned, about a fire at GBC. Some people said it was on purpose, some said it was an accident. Let me just end with one particular story. Judith and I had spent some time trying to access not the music archive at GBC, but rather the news archive and the sort of announcements and the radio stories that they told, which are still on tape, most of them. But one of the things we found is they digitized and kept some of the announcements that were made during coups, but others were not there. Whether they were hidden somewhere in the back or kept, it's not clear. But there was a particular counter-coup that happened in 1983, where an announcement was made by a young Corporal Jiwa that he had taken over the country and overthrown the government of Jerry John Rawlings. This announcement was not kept at GBC as far as we could tell, but I found a copy from someone who had been in the military at the time, who had a cassette recording of someone who made a recording of the announcement on the air and had 3 hours of tape. He just put his radio on and put his tape player on in 1983 and recorded the radio. and it was it was a copy of a copy of a copy that then was put on the MP3 and then circulated among people in '83. He gave it to me 5 years ago as an MP3 recorded on a cassette. So that's the only copy I found of this announcement of this coup, because right after the coup was ended, they erased the records of it. This led to a series of things where actually this past weekend, so this was a gentleman who was killed in 1984 in a second coup attempt, as some of you will know. Some of you may never have heard of Corporal Jiwa. This past weekend, Judith and I went to the funeral for Corporal Jiwa, who was not buried until 38 years after he was killed, partially because the family's fear and uncertainty and the sort of erasure of him from a particular version of the historical record. So then the funeral itself becomes a record of what gets erased and what gets remembered by who, and it's sort of this informal set of archive that falls between the cracks. Some of it being erased on purpose, some of it sort of neglected, and then it's not sure what happened. So I just want to end with that story as a way to say there's all these kinds of ways that we can access things if we are creative and then try and make them accessible. But you know, the destruction of the archive is an ongoing process, and our process is never done when we try and bring them out. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. So to address what's her name? Your question, okay, let me just briefly say that I think the issue has to do with awareness. Okay, you asked the question about what's the work being done, you know, about like individuals who have collections and institutions who have collections, right? Was that your question?
No, my question is how can we work with communities so that the collections stay in the community? They don't have to be in an institution. In my view.
Yeah, so probably that's a way that I will target around community archiving, right? This is, I think, something that we really need to. There's something on Lekpe. My colleague Edwina is here. I think she started something with the institution in the Volta region. And then recently we also got approached by a man who captured the whole of Keta in photos. You know, he just passed just a few weeks ago, and Frank Tabo. So the family approached us, and as a community, he's captured all these photos and negatives, everything, but they were not properly cared for. They didn't even know how to clean and digitize. Meanwhile, they were organizing an exhibition. I think they were just going to use cameras to click. So we went for the collections and trained them, you know, clean them and train them. And they did the exhibition themselves. We just helped them to clean, you know, and digitize. So for me, this is a form of community archiving, right? And again, for me, I feel we need to raise awareness about managing or about audiovisual heritage. Today is, as I mentioned earlier, World Day for Audiovisual Heritage. It's what are the UNESCO centers here doing, you know, to educate us, you know, to raise awareness about how we can, you know, keep these kinds of heritages. And then Intel also talked about how oral narratives, we have, how do we call it, a living heritage. How do we document all these things and keep everyday things happening? Everyday funerals are taking place, so many things are taking place around us. How do we, you know, do all this? So for me, I think the key thing is about awareness, you know, but there's very little some of us can do. We're trying, you know, sometimes we go beyond our borders as archivists and go documenting, capturing things and all, but there's very little to what we can do, you know. So I think and then about access, I always want to promote, it's not all about open access, it's about responsible access. Somebody walks in and says, so I want almost about 200 copies of all these. It is simply not possible, because sometimes the archives also feeds from other people. So, and then putting everything out there. My colleague archivists are saying, oh, open access, but I will say responsible access. If you want to know more about my concept of this, I mean, meet me at the tea table. Talk about that.
We have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I'm going to only address 2 issues. Someone talked about capacity to use versus access. And I'll give one of the projects that we're doing. We're working specifically on, for example, some of the liberation archives. They would, if we leave them the way they are, they'll tend to all be used by researchers, scholars, as you rightly say. But one of the projects that we're doing, because for us it's not about only the archives, and I'll re-emphasize it's about what we're doing with the archives. So one of our main programs is education. So working with educationists from teachers who actually have the skills to simplify the archives into the curricula for students, and then making sure that they are accessed via simple platforms. So one of our partners is MTN. I'm not sure if MTN is working in Ghana, but I think so, because they've got the largest footprint, mobile footprint in Africa. So MTN is partnered with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation to make sure that a student who is residing in a very remote place in an African country, but has got a basic phone and access, and using the MTN ISP, can access our archives and can access them in a way that they understand. So we are working with different researchers, historians, educationists through our programs to make sure that these archives make sense to the different Africans. So we've categorized them as well. So our focus is not just on scholars and researchers at a tertiary or higher level. And then the point on archives and how they link to policies, for us that is one of our main objectives. So within our programs, we want to make sure that the engagement, the knowledge exchange speaks to current issues, and making sure that our communities also engage and understand what are the current policy briefs, what are they saying, what is the government saying in this country, what is happening, and how can we use those archives to make sure that they inform our decisions. So we talk about evidence-informed decisions, right? And evidence-informed research. In our case, we look at evidence-informed research based on those archives, and making sure that whatever decisions are made currently in terms of policies, for example, are based on that. So the engagements and the programs that we have set up are making sure that we have that engagement with civil society and other communities to make sure that we fit into this current policy. So this is something very close to our heart, and it has started happening, especially in South Africa, where it's closer to home, but also looking at the continent policies and making sure that we fit into that process as well. Thank you.
I'm afraid the jet lag is kicking in real hard, but I'm going to try to be coherent. Just to the point about the who's using the archives very quickly. In my experience, I began my career studying northern Ghana, and colonial documents there where you have the district commissioners who are recording everything every 3 days, going around for years and years and years. And my experience, I'm the only historian in there. It's mostly people who are interested in land disputes, chieftaincy, inheritance, etc. And so if you promote what's in there, people will use it. It's highly political. Second point is that I'm a private institution. Archives are very expensive, right? So we're constantly chasing money. So we can't receive everything people. We get calls every day. Please take my stuff. We just can't afford it. Finally, I'm very excited about this conversation. I know it's the beginning of a very important project. We have Kwame Nkrumah Institute at Legon. We have Thabo Mbeki Institute. We have Howard University, and I hope we now have the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture.
So I just want to speak to the idea of audience and who. So again, we're a public institution. Our archives are for public use, for folks who are scholars or who think they're scholars, who want to be scholars, all of those kinds of things. And one of the ways that we do that is through a program called Junior Scholars Program, which is for young people grades in the US, grades 6 to 12, so basically around 12 to 18, so that they can start to understand what the archive is and how to use it and how it helps them to fill in gaps that they're not, education they're not getting in their formal schooling. So I would say that the ways in which we can make the archive more relevant is to make it relevant to young people. And to make it relevant to their lives. There are groups of archivists, they usually call themselves memory workers, who will work with families, work with individuals on how to conserve and preserve their own family histories and family documents and all of that kinds of stuff. I've had many conversations with family members trying to donate things to museums, so on and so forth. I ask them always, are you still using this? If you're still using it, keep it, because what is going to happen is it's going to come to our institution, it's going to sit in a drawer, it may or may not be used. So we have to take and make value of our own stories and other things that are connected with them, because they may not be as valuable to Howard or Harvard or wherever as they are to the folks in our lives. So that is something. Talk to your families, please, 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 before you all come talking about donating things that they think they have right to, they have right to, they have right to. A lot of this, I feel, conversation about archives has to do, when I say obsolescence, I don't just mean obsolescence of the material. This is often coming to terms with the fact that we are not going to be here forever, and that we have to deal with the material that we are either collecting, leaving, or want to leave behind. So that's all I have to say.
So we created a bit of an archive here today. And I'm imagining, I don't know, 30 years from now, so a student is sitting in the archives here at the Institute, and they're logged on, and they're accessing all of this. How did this happen? Just, well, you know, there was this panel one time. I just want to say that honestly, this was amazing. It's a collaborative panel that started well before we appeared before you. It continued this morning, and I have every confidence, as Ben, I'm just going to repeat what you said, that something is building here that could be transformative and actually a model for ways forward that really do the restorative work that needs to happen. And this audience was a really important part of that process. So our last thank you is to you for being here. One announcement from Pong has informed me that all of you are required to go downstairs to be a part of some massive group photo. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, it is correct. And then you can have your coffee. Yes. So thank you all very much.